So first of all, welcome to everyone, and especially to our speakers from Mercy Corps and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who I will be gladly introducing in just a moment. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Megan Price. I'm the head of office for the Knowledge Platform Security and Rule of Law. And we at the Knowledge Platform are committed to creating and convening moments for learning, for exchange, and for helping the different sectors within the security and rule of law sector, those being the research sector, the policy sector, and the programming sector, come together and exchange on things that they're seeing, ideas that they are testing, and promising or invigorating and important research that's coming out of the field at the moment. So that is why we are gathered here today for the Virus and Violence seminar that will be discussing research conducted by Mercy Corps with a response from our MFA colleagues. So I would like to iterate a few housekeeping points that were mentioned by Melissa. If you could all please clarify your names in the chat, that allows us, or in the participants list, that allows us to see who else is in the room, which makes everyone more comfortable and facilitates more engagement. Likewise, if you can have your cameras on, if you feel comfortable doing so, then we welcome that. But we do ask that you remain muted, your mics remain muted until the Q&A session, and I'll give more details about how to engage at that point. Once again, the session is being recorded. The participants list is not recorded. There will be no public record of who participated. And if you keep your camera off and you keep yourself muted, you will not appear in the recording. So the converse of that is if you choose later in the discussion today to turn your camera on and unmute yourself, please be aware that your image and voice will be captured in the recording. So now to the content, the reason that we're here today. So I'm sure many of you have joined because we are all seeing that the COVID-19 is the deadliest pandemic in the century, and it has threatened to intensify disputes, violent conflicts, both globally, but also at national levels. And I think this is something that a lot of us have found in our programming. We're seeing anecdotally, we're hearing about it, we're feeling it viscerally in the way in which some of the programs are being rolled out and challenged, and new dynamics that are coming to the fore in the communities that we're working. This is already building on what was a 30-year high of violent conflict before the pandemic began. So what we're seeing, as I said, in anecdotal and perhaps experienced ways, relies on a certain level of data and actual rigorous research to help us articulate that in a more fundamental way, in a more responsible way, let's say. So this study by Mercy Corps is doing exactly that. It's an effort to understand the impact that COVID-19 has had on conflict dynamics in order to help governments, donors, and policymakers respond effectively. This is exactly where we sit at the Knowledge Platform as one of our raison d'etres, is to make sure that policy ideas, programming changes are informed by evidence and rigorous research. So we hope that by participating in this conversation today, you are able to access some of the important data points that might help inform some decisions, or maybe you can see how your organization might similarly collect hard data on how COVID has impacted programming and conflict dynamics in the areas that you're working in. I'd like now to introduce very briefly our three speakers. We have Gabrielle Aron. She is an independent analyst and the research lead for this particular project. We have Sheila Uzor-Onasanya, and she is the strategic learning manager for Mercy Corps in Nigeria. And we have Frank Huising. He's a senior policy officer at the Stabilization and Humanitarian Aid Department of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that kind of gives a quick overview of our objectives for the day and for this particular session. With that, I'm going to turn over to Gabrielle Aron. Gabrielle is an independent analytical consultant and a conflict advisor. She has over 10 years experience in advising multilateral institutions, INGOs, the diplomatic community, specifically around conflict affected areas and strategies to engage therein. She conducts conflict analysis research and delivers capacity building, conflict sensitivity, and dialogue and mediation initiatives. And she has specialized experience in Myanmar, where she was based from 2013 to 2018, although that's not a case that we'll be speaking about today. She will be introducing the first topic, which is really around the methodology of the studies that were carried out and the key findings. After that, we'll move to Sheila, who will give us more information specifically on the Nigeria case study. With that, Gabrielle, I'd love to hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Megan. And hi, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. We're thrilled to be presenting this research to you. Before we get into the findings, I'd like to start by very briefly just going over the focus and the methodology behind the research. So our aim with the project has really been to highlight the lived experiences of communities who have spent the last year grappling with dual crises of the pandemic on one hand and violence and conflict on the other. We wanted to uncover not only the very visible and immediate linkages between the pandemic and manifestations of conflict and violence, but also to understand how the more subtle or underlying drivers and dynamics surrounding conflict might have been altered due to the entry of this massive external shock into the environment. So to try and investigate this, we decided to use a systems analysis methodology. And in this framing, we can kind of understand COVID-19 as a set of factors that were newly introduced into conflict systems around the world. And this methodology has allowed us to identify both the direct and the indirect causal pathways between factors related to the pandemic and factors related to conflict. And I'm happy to speak more about the methods of the study in the Q&A if that's of interest. We also used a case study approach. So we looked into Afghanistan, Colombia, and Nigeria. We did dedicated field research in each context, and we did comparative analysis as well. And with our targeting framework, we sought to maximize the diversity of our participants, as well as the types of conflict and the types of conflict actors that we were looking at in the study. So to go into now just an overview of some of our key findings. It was quite interesting to see that across our comparative analysis of these three cases, despite the diversity of the context that we were looking at, there were some quite clear commonalities that emerged. Our research found that the COVID-19 pandemic and also the responses to the pandemic have meaningfully exacerbated drivers of conflict, and in some cases have also intensified manifestations of violence and conflict. And moreover, that this has occurred through three overarching what we call pathways of impact, which link the pandemic to secondary and tertiary impacts on conflict and violence. I'll go into each of these pathways more in detail, but the first, just to give a quick overview, is through increasing economic hardship and resource scarcity. The second is through diminishing trust in government leaders and institutions. The third is through disrupting social bonding and eroding social cohesion. So those are the three key areas that we found as common pathways of impact across the study. So we can see that even in places within our target areas where violence had not specifically increased during the pandemic, conflict risks had worsened through worsening pre-existing tensions and grievances, straining social relationships, state-society relationships, and worsening socio-economic inequalities, which collectively set the stage for escalations of violence and conflict, not just in the now, but I think potentially in the future. So to quickly then go into each of these three pathways. The first, as I mentioned, is the impact of the pandemic on increasing economic hardship and intensifying resource competition. We all know that the lockdowns around the world have caused massive resource scarcity, poverty, unemployment, market disruptions, etc. And this has had several impacts that we identified. First, it forced many communities to shift from licit to illicit livelihood activities. So in Colombia, for example, this has manifested as increased crime and a greater number of people working in coca production, to give one example. Another impact is that increased economic vulnerability has made financial compensation for participating in violent organizations, such as armed groups, insurgent groups, and criminal organizations more attractive. And this has therefore served to increase recruitment into these groups in many cases, and the knock-on effect there is increased control and influence of those groups. So for example, in Afghanistan, there appears to have been an opportunistic shift, for example, by the Taliban and other armed groups to use financial incentives rather than ideological incentives as their primary recruitment tactic during the pandemic to take advantage of that economic vulnerability. And finally, on this first pathway, these in terms of the economic linkages between conflict, intensified competition of resources. We also saw that things like COVID relief and natural resources, especially land and water, led to an escalation of pre-existing resource conflicts, such as, I think Sheila might mention this later, farmer-herder conflict in Nigeria. So then to move on to the second pathway, which is diminishing trust in government leaders and institutions. We saw quite low levels of trust in the case study context prior to the pandemic, particularly in Afghanistan and Nigeria. So this is not a new phenomenon. However, we did note that even with this quite low level of trust, the global scale and the significant economic hardship caused by the pandemic and its mitigation policies did in fact appear to generate some increased expectations of state support. And so there was a slight shift, it seems, in expectations that authorities should do more to uphold their end of the social contract. And when these expectations were not met, this exacerbated grievances, which our evidence shows may then in turn exacerbate structural drivers of conflict, both in the short term, medium term, and we're also taking an eye to the long term as well. To give one example from Afghanistan, participants in nearly all of our target areas shared stories of misappropriation of COVID relief by local intermediaries that had been designated by the government for aid distribution. And this exclusion often occurred along ethnic or tribal lines, or according to socio-economic status or displacement status. And in many cases, this actually escalated or sparked new rounds of intercommunal conflict. And it was quite interesting to see that in Afghanistan, this grievance around COVID relief misappropriation was much more prominent in the data set than the lockdown policies or the public health response in terms of those state society grievances and mistrust. So to end then with the final pathway, which is around social cohesion. The pandemic and particularly the lockdown initially seemed to have a positive effect on social relations in some local areas, although this was not the case in all areas. But where it did happen, it was in many cases short-lived. The knock-on effects of increased economic deprivation and reduced opportunities for social bonding due to lockdown and other disruptions really did have a lasting impact on weakening cohesion both within and between communities and identity groups. So for example, in Afghanistan, one of the major issues was divergent knowledge, attitudes, and practices, what we sometimes call CAP, regarding the pandemic and adherence to pandemic mitigation measures. So where conflict is so pervasive in Afghanistan, these social bonding activities such as attendance at funerals or prayers or weddings and other events are actually quite critical to social cohesion. And participants shared that because there had been a restriction on attendance in these events, and as well some elements of the community or kinship groups were adhering to COVID regulations and others were not, that caused quite a lot of tension when there was differing interpretations of the pandemic and how to respond to it. And non-attendance at these events led to significant breakdowns in relations, especially within kinship groups, but also more broadly within communities. And despite the fact that the pandemic during the data collection period was seen as being sort of in a lull, the participants shared that the social cohesion damages had been lasting quite far beyond the immediate spike in cases and the lockdown. So this has been just a very, very quick summary of the many nuanced impacts that we identified through the research. I think just a last point to highlight is that as a result of these impacts, various disruptive actors, armed groups, criminal networks, political entrepreneurs were able to really capitalize on the instability and vulnerabilities generated by the pandemic to expand their spheres of influence. And this really has exacerbated existing forms of conflict and violence and also has the potential to escalate and add some more complexity to dynamics surrounding conflict and violence in the future. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Sheila to give us some illustration from Nigeria.
Great. Thank you very much, Gabrielle. I'm going to take a quick moment to also introduce Sheila a little bit more thoroughly, give her credit where credit is due. So Sheila is joining us from the Nigeria office of Mercy Corps, and there she is responsible for supporting and facilitating program quality, objectives, and learning outcomes for the country portfolio. And she also brings over 10 years experience in the humanitarian and development sector, and she's been working on designing and implementing results-based systems. So she's here, as Gabrielle said, to present a little bit of more of a deeper dive specifically into the Nigeria context. Sheila, please welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Gabriella. I would like to start by illustrating Gabriella's very last point on social cohesion and give a very concrete example from Nigeria. So during the study in the Fulani community, in one of the locations where we worked, a community of herders shared experiences of how the lockdown restrictions of the COVID-19 pandemic influenced their relationship with other rival ethnic groups in the community. So this temporarily sort of increased social cohesion by creating a sense of mutual vulnerability amongst these groups to a common threat and a shared purpose of surviving and overcoming the COVID-19 situation. Particularly the closure of markets forced these communities to start to sell and buy from each other, something they usually wouldn't do before COVID. So this was because they mostly didn't have access to the bigger markets because of the restrictions in movement. So they had to sort of put aside some of these communal disputes between farmers and herders in the community so that economic trade could happen peacefully. Additionally, the COVID-19 lockdown related movement restrictions also contributed to reducing inter-group conflicts by limiting many of the types of negative interactions that exacerbated disputes driven by resource scarcity. However, the lockdown restrictions seemed only applicable to humans, and that therefore meant that while farmers could not go to the farms, herders were still able to move around with their cattle. And this meant that farm encroachment was still likely to happen and potentially could fuel future conflicts after the lockdown restrictions imposed by the pandemic. Now, another example is in communities in Kaduna and Plateau State, the end of the lockdown led to new inter-group grievances. This was after the lockdown situation, such as disputes that had started during the lockdown. For example, pastoralists taking advantage of lockdown to graze their cattle on farmlands, or narratives about identity-based favoritism with government responses. And this is something that we saw around targeting when the palliative issues came up. Now, to throw a bit more context around the situation in Nigeria, especially around the economic situation, Nigeria has had a hard hit on its economy in the last few years. The country plunged into recession for the second time in 4 years as the petroleum prices dropped in the midst of COVID-19. There was a 38% drop in the GDP during the initial 5-week lockdown period between March and April 2020 alone. Abductions and forced disappearances, kidnapping as we tagged it here, became more rampant in 2020, driven by the proliferation of so many other criminal activities, especially in the northern central part of Nigeria. The pandemic and its resultant safety regulations also caused further loss for livelihoods among the poor. And unfortunately, the government's attempt at mitigating the increasing economic hardship during the pandemic only seemed to have fueled the level of mistrust amongst the people, particularly intensifying youth grievances and sparking social unrest. This somewhat eventually resulted in the looting of the government warehouses we saw in search of what was generally termed at that time as palliatives. The COVID-19 lockdown and movement restrictions increased the usage of smartphones. And this was very interesting because text messaging, social media, which led to an increased awareness of rights and broader visibility of government's abuse of power, particularly among the youth who were very active. In fact, we have data saying that between January 2020 and January 2021, smartphone usage in Nigeria increased by 10%. Internet users increased by 22%, and social media usage also increased by about 22%. So this gave the opportunity for more visibility around issues that were going on in the country at the point. The government's pandemic response provided a number of higher visible examples of mismanagement of abuse of power, which were then documented, shared, and amplified through increasingly activity around the digital platforms. Now, community members reported during this research particularly, community members reported substantial shortages and delays in the government's planned distribution of palliative food materials to individuals. And for this, community members also described these gaps in the palliative distribution as evidence of partisan politics, ethno-religious favoritism, or outright nepotism. And in some cases, community members were describing these issues as issues related to corruption. So we saw that these were some of the things that fueled some of the social unrest we saw during the period. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sheila, for those very specific, concrete examples that really help bring more to the forefront our visualization of these wider trends and impacts. I'm going to turn back now to Gabrielle, who's going to give us a few of the conclusions and recommendations that are being generated through this research.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks so much, Sheila. So to conclude, we really believe that this research has important implications both for programming and for policy as we continue to respond to the pandemic in fragile and conflict-affected areas, and also to prepare for coming waves of the crisis where we may see coming additional waves of these dynamics surrounding conflict and violence as well. So some of the key recommendations we would like to offer include, first, the importance of really meaningfully engaging with local communities and community-based service delivery actors. Donors and international implementing agencies should accelerate the localization agenda. This is something that we've spoken about quite a lot as an international community, but it's quite evident now that it's more important than ever. This may require considering new modalities, for example, for oversight or community accountability and complaints response. But this is very essential to ensure contextually relevant pandemic response and recovery, conflict prevention, and building back more resilient systems. And this is important because we've seen the challenges in government service delivery in these contexts during the pandemic, as well as the reductions in trust in government service delivery, as we've highlighted. So again, this local engagement with alternative service delivery actors and communities themselves is now highly relevant and important. Secondly, it's quite essential to integrate conflict prevention and mitigation approaches into the COVID-19 response rather than responding to the public health component of the crisis more in silo. Our research underscores the importance of moving away from a reactive approach to conflict that primarily focuses on treating the symptoms, including violence, and moving towards a more preventative approach. To mitigate the secondary impacts of the pandemic on instability and insecurity, and to prevent the eruption of new conflicts, and many of which the drivers have intensified as a result of the pandemic, INGOs and donors should ensure that conflict prevention and peace-building programs are integrated into their response strategies. This should include committing to integrating both local and macro-level conflict analysis into all pandemic response activities from the program design stage, setting up strong monitoring mechanisms to promote good governance in pandemic response grant allocations, and working with governments to integrate adaptive modalities for local conflict resolution in anticipation of increased pandemic-related tensions. It's also quite essential to ensure that the pandemic response includes a strong component of economic safety net and livelihoods recovery to minimize incentives for illicit economic activities or recruitment into armed or criminal organizations. So again, this kind of holistic integrated approach is quite essential. And lastly, I think it's just important to highlight that our research shows that there is so much more to be uncovered in this issue in terms of the impacts of the pandemic on conflict and violence. It's really important to further invest in ongoing and localized research on these impacts. The linkages are quite complex, and while we did find very interesting and strong commonalities across our case studies, we also found that the nuances of local contexts, even down to the community level, are ultimately what shape outcomes related to conflict and violence in the context of this pandemic. So understanding these contextually specific nuances are really important for identifying the leverage points for donors and practitioners to help mitigate these secondary impacts. So I think donors and implementing agencies can contribute to a more holistic and conflict mitigating pandemic response, in part by funding country-specific and community-specific research into this intersection between the pandemic and conflict and violence. So with that, I will wrap up, and thanks very much for your attention, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. I think I, for one, really appreciate those very concrete and specific recommendations that really help us kind of place what are the actual action points for the avenues for change, what are our objectives for change in the way that things are currently run and how they could be improved upon. I, for one, often recognize the way in which security and rule of law policies and programming seem to kind of be their own sector, their own silo, and they're done in addition to wider development aid or governance aid. And it's, I think, an important point that you make, that these more holistic approaches are integrated in order to really allow security and rule of law programming to be a mitigating strategy rather than a responsive strategy. With that, I'm really excited to turn over to Frank Huizing from the MFA, because I think that is something that the Dutch MFA is striving to achieve. So Frank has worked for a while within the Stabilization and Humanitarian Aid Department of the Dutch Ministry. There he focuses on issues of conflict prevention, women, peace, and security, and he was previously actually assigned to the MFA task force on the COVID response. So with that in mind, he has some reflections from how this rolled out in the policy sphere earlier last year as these ideas were taking shape. So after just one more second, after Frank's intervention, that will officially kick off the Q&A section. I will give more instructions for how to participate in the Q&A, but I want to just put that on your radar now as participants to start formulating your questions and preparing your questions for Gabrielle, Frank, and Sheila. With that, Frank, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Megan and Messina and colleagues for organizing this, and also to the Mercy Corps colleagues. And the Mercy Corps analysis was there right at the start of the pandemic, where it seemed after a few weeks, their first piece of analysis seemed to be coming out, and they were always super useful. So within the task force, we shared a lot of information with the minister and with colleagues, and I used Mercy Corps analysis a lot for that. Recently, we wrote a letter to the Dutch Senate because a question was asked on how COVID risks have an impact on conflict, and how COVID has an impact on conflict risks, and what we should do about it. So I thought I'd quickly run through this letter, quickly mention the main points in the letter, because it sort of structured what our thinking was last year and last few months. Since we are currently forming a government in the Netherlands, this is not the time to make letters full of new policy announcements. So it basically gives some thoughts and some reflections, and then it's up to the new minister and for us in the coming months to see how to follow up on this. And I think many of the things that are in this letter also come from analysis by Mercy Corps and others, so there might be a lot of overlap. So I quickly go through the analysis that focuses on conflict risks that relate to the socio-economic impact. So inequality, economic inequality in society between groups. Secondly, governance and trust between people and their governments, as you mentioned as well. The role of the misinformation, fueling mistrust. And this has an impact on the relation between governments and their citizens, but also between communities. And then the pandemic being used to crack down on opposition, to crack down on civil and political rights. Maybe on our response. So from the start of the response, it is good that many organizations quickly alerted everyone that the response has to be conflict sensitive and smart. At the same time, I think that the response was quickly rolled out. So I don't have a real grasp on how well the international community did on that and how well we did on that. But it was something that because of those with experience in addressing pandemics alerted us that you have to be conflict sensitive if you want to do it well. In the letter, we also mentioned our own partners' flexibility. We gave some flexibility within our own fundings to address the pandemic. You can discuss whether that was enough, but we saw that some of our mediation and peace building actors were actually the ones that partners were actually the ones that could reach communities that were hard to reach and alert them to the risks of COVID. Looking forward, maybe the most sort of policy rich part of the letter. we underline the importance of investing in conflict prevention now, because we see the risk rising. Of course, as in all our letters now, we write a lot on building back better and building forward together. And that includes working towards inclusive and well-functioning societies, working on human security, social cohesion, and thereby becoming more resilient, which is also a buzzword often, with sometimes very well defined and sometimes less well defined, and supporting more resilient societies because they're better protected against the risk of violent conflict. And one thing that comes back is using a people-centered approach, which is something that we said before, working from the perspective of the local population when it comes to security and rule of law. And we aim to do this, and there's many programs in which we do this, but doing it well everywhere is of course a challenge, also in a time when there's limited capacity to manage programs, and there's also a push to go to bigger programs. And then on localization, in that sense, there was sort of a perfect storm with the combination of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protest that started a discussion internationally, but also within our ministry on what is decolonizing aid, what is localization. When you can travel, but you can Zoom or call, does that change something in the relationship between headquarters of organizations and their local partners, who should be in the lead? So I don't follow this discussion closely within the ministry, but it's definitely a discussion that is probably as old as development aid itself in different ways, but it restarted and came to prominence again last year. So I'm really curious what will come out of that. Maybe to conclude, in Dutch we say, I looked up if there was an English saying as well. It's not. We say paper is patient. It's easy to write things down on paper, and now it's up to us to see how we translate all these lofty words into bureaucratic practice, and that's something to do in the next few months and years. But thanks again for the excellent research, because it really helps us in our offices far away sometimes to sharpen our thinking. Thanks.
Excellent, thanks. Thank you very much, Frank, for those candid and honest assessments of how these discussions are being carried out in the halls of the ministry in the Netherlands. I want to draw people's attention also to the chat, where we've posted a link to the letter to Parliament that Frank was referring to. So if you'd like to read further details on that, you can find the link in the chat. I also really appreciate, Frank, kind of some of the paradoxes that you drew out in this, because I think it would be all too easy for us to declare, of course, these recommendations posed by Mercy Corps are sensible and they should be immediately taken up. And how do we then address the bureaucratic structures that might be standing in the way of that, or might be causing pause, or might be asserting different priorities? And I think kind of the points that you make about the need for more focus might mean fewer countries, but bigger programs. Does that work counter to the very contextualized, very people-centered approaches that are ideologically and even just effectively the desired way of going about it? And also, one thing that you said that I thought really made a lot of sense was that reflection on the way in which, at the moment, at that point of crisis, there was a need to quickly revert to partnerships that had been long-standing, and these longer-term relationships that have created trust between a donor and an implementing organization or a local organization, for example. I think that also is somewhat resurgent in the relevance of how does social cohesion, how does trust help facilitate processes in these times of crisis. That's not just at the very local level between individuals in a community, but it can also be expanded outward to the macro level between donors and their implementing organizations. With that, the paradox there is that if you rely consistently on longer term relationships, does that block certain groups out? Does that mean that there's an in-group that has that access, and then an out-group that perhaps is not able to bring forward agile new ideas and innovations? So there's lots of paradoxes here to wrestle with. And I think that it's good that we're talking about them and identifying them, and also giving each other that bit of support to recognize that, that we're doing this together. With that, I'd like to turn to the Q&A session, because that's always one of the more interesting parts of these meetings. We have such a rich community with so many interesting perspectives to share. There are two ways in which you can participate in the Q&A. I've seen already that a few questions have been posted in the chat. We will try to keep up with those, but the most effective way for you to engage is to simply raise your hand. We try to keep these discussions open and collaborative. If you are called upon, I will call upon people in the order that I see hands raised, and then we invite you to turn on your microphone and even your camera if you're comfortable, and simply address your question to the speakers. If you're having trouble finding out how to raise your hand, you can go down to the bottom of your screen next to the mute and the video. There should be a reactions button. In that reactions button, you have the opportunity to raise your hand. So that's one way to put forward. Another way is to simply, if you would not feel comfortable putting your face and voice on screen and therefore being captured in the recording, we invite you to submit your question anonymously to the KPSRL Secretariat. So you'll find that at the top of your participants list. You can write a message directly to the KPSRL Secretariat, and Melissa will receive those messages, those questions, and she'll be able to share them on your behalf without revealing your personal identity or details. So with that, I'm going to open the floor for anyone who has a question and would like to raise their hand to address one of their questions to the speakers. Rosetta, I see you first. Rosetta, welcome to the conversation. Please go ahead.
Hello, Megan. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the presenters, that's Sheila and Gabriel and Frank. This is a rich research and very helpful. So my name is Rosetta. I work with International Alert. I'm based in Borno State, Northeast Nigeria. And I actually have 2 questions that come up as a concern, and I'll hope to get some feedback from the researchers. The first is about the localization agenda. It was very helpful during the lockdown to engage with the community stakeholders to continue with the activities. But the major concern we had was the effect of the insurgency and how it generated a lot of migration. Communities we work in, every now and then they get attacked and then they run away to seek shelter elsewhere. So by the time we return there, we meet either nobody or the new set of stakeholders that we have to start a fresh sensitization, get them to buy into the project. So this is a huge concern. Localization agenda, fantastic, it works, but only if we have a stable community base, you understand, where the attacks do not necessitate people running away, and then by the time you want to go restart your activities, your interventions, you're now having to meet with new set of people. So how do we circumnavigate that particular problem when we have to focus on the localization agenda? Secondly, integrating conflict peace building activities into all our interventions, be it humanitarian or development intervention. Fantastic, it's something we've been campaigning for. But the thing is, he who plays the piper dictates the tune. If the donor tells you, look, I don't have enough money to fund full-scale peace building programming, we know that peace building is very process driven. You can invest up to 70–80% of your time in the process and just see about 20 to 30% of the results. So a number of donors do not really understand, why should it take this long? So, I mean, how do we, so one of the things we have realized about that gives us that challenge is that in peace building, we have not really figured out how to communicate processes to the extent that it really captures the imagination of the decision makers at the donor institution. How can we handle that? Because I really love the aspect of the policy influencing from this research. So how can we, structure good communication that will communicate the impact, the need to invest into process, good quality process that will give us good results when it comes to conflict mitigation activities as needed to be integrated into different interventions. Thank you. Over.
Those were excellent questions, Rosetta, extremely practical, and I think probably profoundly relatable to many people in the room. And I just want to, before turning to the speakers, also point out that this point about the challenges of illustrating the results of peace building and the efforts that go into peace building when you get out of it, it is incredibly important also in a time when donor budgets are shrinking, when donor countries are becoming increasingly conservative about how public money is spent. And that tends to push towards what we would call traditional development in education, WASH, in governance programs that lead to very concrete results, buildings built, you can count them up. So it is a challenge that I think is incredibly important for our wider sector to try to figure out how do we better illustrate the value of the impact that we are investing in, because it is so valuable. But exactly as you say, Rosetta, it becomes very tricky, very difficult to illustrate it. And I'm wondering if localization of accountability can maybe provide a pathway forward. With
Exactly.
that, Sheila and Gabriela, I'd love to hear your reflections. Frank as well, obviously, if you have reflections on this, those questions are incredibly relevant to your sector as well.
Okay, so I'm happy to start off, especially because she's coming from a Nigerian context. And I thank you again for those questions. I think those are really key issues that we need to talk about openly. The first one is about the localized agenda. That's a huge challenge. We're dealing with a very mobile population. However, I think we can find innovative ways, especially to work with the host communities. So you realize that a lot of our interventions are actually focused on these populations that keep moving, these migration that keep happening. But then there are also the set of people who are within those communities who are also unable to move. So we may also start to think about how do we work with these host communities to ensure social cohesion, because we find that one of the key issues around peace building is ensuring that we have social cohesion happening. And right now we find that conflict is beginning to brew between host communities and then people who are migrating. So we need to also start to think about how do we work better with host communities to ensure that localized agenda, and they are also built and ready to support these other migrants that are coming through their communities. I'm just going to try and give really quick responses so Gabrielle could also contribute. The second point question, particularly around peace building and integrating that into all humanitarian activities. I totally agree with you. It's a huge challenge trying to manage the expectations of the donor who already have set priorities. But I also see a huge opportunity with such research activities that we conduct that provides evidence that allow us to come up with more innovative designs of our project. A lot of times, I think we as implementers also try to design our projects specifically to meet the needs of the donor. But then we have the evidence from the research that we conduct, and we are in the position to provide this evidence to the donor and say, hey, this is what we think you can also do to help us achieve our goal. Because I think at the end of the day, with programming, there's a theory of change. We want to create a larger shift up there. And everyone who wants to focus on that change should be open to what the evidence is saying, that this is the best approach to getting the change done. So I'm going to leave it at that and allow Gabrielle and Frank to also respond to this.
Thanks, Sheila. I don't have too much more to add. I would say that, you know, both of these issues are very broad and very complex, and they're things that we're grappling with as a sector even prior to the pandemic entering onto the scene. So what I would just add on both points actually is that our research positions the pandemic as a sort of disruptor in the sphere of humanitarian aid and as well development support. And so I think that we can use this as an opportunity to say, you know, innovation is not only something that is on the agenda, but it's necessary, and the time has come to really prioritize it. And I hope that through this research and some of our findings and recommendations, we can help to make the case for donors and implementing agencies alike to really prioritize a restructuring of how we think through and respond to some of these issues and complexities in a way that is you know, we can see already it is necessary to find new ways to work in order to avoid some of the really quite negative compounding effects of things like conflict and violence and a major external shock like the pandemic.
Frank, do you have any further reflections on that, perhaps from a donor perspective about, because I'm sure this is something that you've interacted with some of the programs that you work with, where it's difficult to pin down results. And meanwhile, you have accountability upward to demonstrate what are we getting for our value for money here. So how do you approach this dilemma?
And this is a question I think that we discuss a lot in the ministry, and there's every year we have a results report to Parliament, and we have to sort of count our results, and then there's all these things that are easy to be counted, the amount of the square meters that we on which we did demining activities. So it's a very easy one. People understand it. And there's of course the risk that some things are easier to communicate about, and those will then be the things that you communicate about. And this is the thing that parliaments read, and they will understand it best. Might also help the support for those activities. So there's really, I think, a risk in what we report, how we focus our reporting, sort of our accountability, and what that means for what we prioritize. And I think we still grapple with this sort of focus on results that can be counted versus qualitative results that we can present and understand. But I think we still have a hard time actually doing that.
Understood. So perhaps not a satisfying conclusion at this moment, but at least a shared struggle. If I can maybe make two interventions on this point. And I'm also curious, maybe if Sheila had any reflections, because your mention of the way in which digital communication and information had surged during the pandemic, and whether or not that was facilitative for continuing communication with migrating or perhaps fleeing communities, if that was in any way supportive. But then the second point on the accountability, I'm curious to see whether or not this localization agenda that we see being at least rhetorically emphasized a lot lately might actually help us understand new ways of structuring accountability, and that ways of promoting accountability that is in the hands of those who are being supported by the initiatives, and whether or not that might provide new ways of looking at how programs are held accountable for their results. A second thing is that I think all of us in this community have a responsibility to continue to emphasize that it's not as if development progress isn't important. It very much is. Humanitarian aid is so incredibly important in the moment. Migration and regularizing migration is an area of policy that receives quite a lot of attention, and duly so. But these programs are reliant on stable societies, and development investments can be washed away so quickly once societies lose their grasp on peace and security. And similar for humanitarian aid, it can be used very inefficiently if it's not simply directed at kind of very specific areas. And if there's an increase in violence across the world, then humanitarian aid becomes spread very thin and becomes inefficient. So the point is that a lot of these programs around peace building, around inclusive governments, around security and rule of law are core and essential for all of those other initiatives to actually have the impact that they can then boast in their results programs, results framework. So I would just encourage everyone to kind of try and make sure that we are emphasizing that deeper thinking around how our programs relate to those who might have more support from donors. With that, I have noticed that there have been a couple of points or questions raised in the chat. Melissa, are you available to go through them and point to anyone individual? Otherwise, I can.
Yes, no problem. So I see Tijani Babakura asked a question in the chat directed to Sheila. Tijani, do you want to turn on your camera and microphone and ask your question directly? If not, then I can also read it out for you. All right. I will read it out for you since it was directed publicly. So Sheila, the question was, as much as smartphone and internet usage increases awareness, quite evidently, was there an interest in the research toward looking at negative consequences of the internet, such as rumors or false information that may further exacerbate violent conflicts in Nigeria?
So this particular research didn't necessarily focus on social media and its effect. As Gabriela had given an overview of this research, it was more or less focused on a systems analysis of the different factors of conflict. And it was during the conversations that social media came up as one of the key pathways around social unrest. So we didn't have a specific focus on social media and its possible positive and negative effect. However, I'm aware that in Mercy Corps, in one of our peace building programs, we tried to create a rumor tracking app. And that was a very useful app for us to be able to see what the effect of the use of social media is in some of the rumors and negative effects of promoting some form of unrest. So this research didn't focus on that necessarily, but then I'm sure there's other research available that we can probably triangulate on or get some more information on that.
Excellent, thanks. Melissa, perhaps have you received any anonymous questions submitted through to you directly?
There is one, but there was a public one that was posed first by a person whose last name is Ahmed. And I don't think they specified to whom this question is directed, but the question is, several studies have shown an increase in gender-based violence in both Western countries as well as in African countries. How then can we identify populations' internal characteristics that help to promote endogenous solutions based on values and culture?
So I can try to tackle this one. I think maybe what I'll do is point to some of what we found in Afghanistan around the impacts on gender-based violence due to the pandemic, and just looking at some of the intermediary factors that kind of were along that causal pathway between the pandemic and the increases in GBV, which I think you know, are in some cases context specific, and in some cases are very quite relevant to the local culture and society. Our study did not cover countries, case study countries in the West, so I can't speak more specifically to you know, those dynamics, but I think nonetheless it might be interesting to talk a little bit about Afghanistan. So one of the key patterns around gender-based violence in Afghanistan as a result of the pandemic was related to increased economic vulnerability and lockdown restrictions. So we had many participants sharing how the men in the community were now spending more time in the home, either because of lockdown or because of unemployment, or in many cases both, and how this time spent in the home and as well as the kind of strain of additional economic vulnerability, the kind of the gender norms around masculinities in that society, and being able to be a provider and not being successful in being a provider during the lockdown, and the kind of lasting economic fallout of that. This led to what participants framed as a significant increase in mental health problems and also in drug addiction amongst men. And in turn, these both contributed to increases in gender-based violence. As well, women, or rather girls, were, although female attendance at school is fairly low in Afghanistan, in areas where there were girls going to school, the lockdown made it such that girls were now at home. And this increased the incidence of early and forced marriage, because the thinking in some of these communities was that if girls are not in school, then they should be married. As well, there was a reported increase in the bride price, so the dowry for the women or girls being married that the family receives. So this was increased by a significant factor in some cases, and this seemed to be linked to the shifts in market dynamics and economic vulnerability. And so there was quite an emphasis on what we can kind of see as female assets or female commodities, like their bride price, which contributed to things like early and forced marriages. And in many cases, these situations, especially when a high price has been paid for a girl or a woman, that can also exacerbate her vulnerability to violence in that family. An additional dynamic was around female inheritance. So there is the right to female inheritance from her father in Afghanistan, but during the pandemic, the incidences of male relatives, either husbands or brothers or fathers, seeking to capture or co-opt the female right to their inheritance during this time, particularly around land, intensified, and this actually increased violence among families, either between male relatives who were kind of vying for access to this woman's right to inheritance and the kind of economic value that goes along with that. And as well, in many cases, this led to increased kind of punishment of the female if this attempt to capture was not successful. So we can see how many of the dynamics related to gender and many of the contributing factors to gender-based violence that already existed in the society were intensified or worsened because of factors surrounding the pandemic and the pandemic response. And I think that in different societies, this is played out in different ways, but that absolutely we can see clear pathways there. Sheila, if you have anything to add, or Frank.
No, Gabriella, I think you covered most of it. I think just specifically in Nigeria, the research also did pull out some interesting findings around gender-based violence during the period of the pandemic, especially during the lockdown restrictions. In some cases, in some communities, the incidences around rape were really high on the, so it's something that is really akin to everything that you have described. So I think your responses are fine.
Great. No, I wanted to also, it's an excellent answer. And also I want to point out that what is very useful about the way in which you frame these is that because everything is so incredibly context specific, it's impossible for a single study to outline all the ways in which COVID is going to impact a certain community or the conflict dynamics in a certain country. But what this can do is help people start their search and start their organizing of their thoughts and their data on where are likely places to look for how COVID might be influencing a country that hasn't necessarily been covered in this study. But for those organizations who are struggling to articulate the way in which COVID has impacted conflict dynamics, the study can provide some insights into where to begin and where to look. With that, I'd like to call upon, I see a couple more comments and questions in the chat. So I'm gonna call upon Hugo. I believe you indicated something about the work that you guys are doing in South Africa. So Hugo van der Meer, I welcome you to the floor. And then with that, I'm going to allow everyone to realize that we are reaching 3 o'clock. I'm going to extend the time by 10 minutes so that we can accommodate a couple more questions. But just everyone to allow you to know that we are running up against time. Hugo, please, welcome to the floor.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the presenters. This has been a fantastic webinar. And it links very nicely to research that we're doing to look at the impact of COVID in South Africa, and also partners in Benin and Burkina Faso doing similar work. And essentially, just to point out, there are some positive things that we're also documenting around specifically government support programs that were in existence before COVID and have been used, kind of expanded or repurposed in some ways during COVID. And just the fact that the infrastructure is there for parental support grants, for example, that those were just inflated specifically during COVID. There are government employment programs, the community work program in South Africa, where they were repurposed and given healthcare responsibilities or distribution of protective equipment, etc. So just the fact that that infrastructure exists, rather than being invented, and when something is rolled out very quickly, then the opportunities, and we've seen that in South Africa, corruption creeping in, but where it's an existing program where you don't have to sign up new people, you don't have to kind of create whole new revenue streams. It's much more efficient, and I think that there's a trust already. There's existing relationships in the community with these systems. And exactly these issues that we see in South Africa, and there's contrasting. There's certain avenues where conflict is increased, and others where actually there's an appreciation of what government can do when the systems are there. So I'm curious just about the parallels about what actually has worked in terms of what government can do well. Thank you.
Excellent input. Sheila or Gabrielle, I don't know if you have immediate responses. There was a little bit of a breaking up, but primarily the question revolves around that the valence, the direction of COVID impact doesn't necessarily go just in the negative direction. It also creates opportunities for positive government interventions, and building upon existing structures for government interventions appears to be an effective way of maintaining and even increasing trust. And the question is, yeah, have you seen other ways in which interventions have actually been very positive in response to COVID?
I think this is a tricky one for us because I think in our particular context, and of course, you know, there's a bit of an inherent bias in the responses of community participants who are much more likely to talk about grievances towards government than positive outcomes in many cases. So I think, you know, what we saw generally was that the kind of presence of the state or the lack thereof was quite a major issue in terms of the success of COVID relief programs and distribution, as well as kind of the success in kind of the campaign for positive public perceptions of the government response. So I mean, in Afghanistan and Nigeria, there was quite minimal trust in the government to begin with, and issues around corruption and misappropriation and sort of identity-based exclusion were already endemic within those contexts. And so the impact of the pandemic primarily was to kind of underscore and spotlight those issues and to bring them much more to the fore, in a sense, because people were in a place of greater need than they had been even prior. So I can't say, I led the Afghanistan research in particular, and I can't say that there were particularly many positive reflections on the state and the kind of state-society relations. It was rather more in the other direction. But I don't know, Sheila, from Nigeria, if you saw some positive examples of kind of the ability of the state to respond effectively.
So I think a very important thing to mention is the time frame within which this research was done was a time where there were really high perceptions, negative perceptions towards the government, because this just happened right after the lockdown measures were set in and right after all the social unrest that happened. So it was very much unlikely for us to even get any form of data around any positive reactions or adaptations with government structures around COVID-19. However, I'm aware that there are government structures that have sort of adapted to try and work more efficiently around COVID. But then another thing is information gaps are there. When I was talking earlier, and I was talking about how social media sort of amplified some of the mismanagement that was happening with government, unfortunately, the same platform is not used to also disseminate positive information about the structures that, the positive structures that are probably being set in place by the government. So unfortunately, it wasn't something that this research in particular was able to capture. One, because of the timing, and another thing was because of gaps in information distribution from the government end.
Understood. But then all the more reason perhaps to look further to some of the research that's being carried out by other partners. And Hugo, if you have any publications or any data points or even just contact details that you could put in the chat, so if there are others who are curious to hear more about the way in which repurposing existing government programs can be an effective way of creating better responses and trust building or at least trust maintenance. That would be much appreciated. I'm going to move us ever so gently towards the closing of the event. Unless I see no further hands at the moment, I'm going to do a quick cross-check with Melissa. Have you seen additional questions that we can try and sneak in the last minute?
Not at the moment, no. I think we're okay to close.
Excellent. Well then, with that, just a few reflections, at least from my part. I found this to be an incredibly informative and really practical and useful exchange. So I appreciate very much all three speakers for their candor, for their specificity, and for the way that we are looking to kind of exchange specifically on what can be done, what do we need to look for. One thing that really seemed to arise quite often was this aspect of trust between people and their governments, trust between donors and their implementing partners, trust between implementing partners and people. It really does bring to light the importance of trust relationships and how they contribute to stability and how they can contribute to agility at the time of crisis when it's needed. So all the more reason to make sure that we're investing well into our partnerships and leading in that way. I also want to kind of point out what I thought was a really important fundamental theme underlying this, that it's not necessarily that COVID is creating crises or it is creating a crisis. That was poorly put by me. It's not creating new conflict dynamics so much as it's exacerbating current tensions, existing tensions, and that those small and even temporary breakages in relationships can have very lasting long-term impacts. So the importance of really taking these times very seriously, taking the way that COVID is influencing conflict dynamics seriously, because it is likely that they will remain a factor in conflict going forward and needs to be continually followed and continually assessed. I think Mercy Corps has done an excellent job in helping us all understand a little bit better how can we frame our understanding of COVID's impact on conflict, and how can we continue to look for solutions and better policy and programming approaches in the future. With that, I'm going to thank very much Gabriela Aron and Sheila Onasanya and Frank Housing for your guys' interventions, and to everyone who participated both by giving us interesting questions in the chat and personally, and those of you who have been able to stay. I believe that we have one last slide, and this is our request to you. We obviously host these seminars free of charge. That is because we are a public service, and in that spirit of public service, we are continually trying to improve how we provide our seminars and our webinars. So if you use your iPhone camera on this QR code, it will take you to a survey about how we did. We absolutely use the feedback on this survey to continue to improve our model for webinars and seminars and these convening discussions. So we would greatly appreciate 3 minutes of your time to give us some feedback. Tell us what we can improve. Tell us what you appreciate. We definitely use it to continue to improve our own approaches. Finally, once again, thank you all to our speakers and to you, our participants. And we look forward to engaging you again in the future.